People who accidentally killed someone, how are you? I came close once, and it troubled me for a long time. My grandfather, who I was adopted by, suffers from PTSD. While he's had faults as a parent, he is one of the people I respect the most. I don't know how familiar you are with PTSD flashbacks, but they can be pretty frightening, and they're hard to predict. One day I came home from school, and he was yelling at my sister, who's 2 years my senior. A 30-year Vietnam veteran yelling is a very scary experience. Especially because he does not yell normally, no matter how upset he gets. He began to threaten her, and things got physical. I felt as if I had to step in, and so I did. It was very difficult to remain calm, because things were getting violent and everybody was yelling. My sister was yelling at him for being mad. He was practically growling, and my grandmother and myself were trying to verbally calm him down. Eventually he grabbed my sister by the neck, and I had to step in. I fought him, and it ended with me kicking him just below the sternum and staggering him. He calmed down, but didn't remember anything. For him, it's like it never happened. The next week he had internal bleeding. I had managed to severely damage the surgical apparatus that had been placed in his stomach after a recent bowel bypass surgery. He ended up going to the hospital and came close to dying a few times. It was very frightening for me. I've regretted not being able to stop him without hurting him, and regretting how close he came to death. I don't know what I'd do if he had died. He still doesn't remember. As far as I know, he thinks it was a complication with the original surgery. I don't know if you're going to find many people who actually killed someone, so I'll give my story. I did not kill her, but I partially paralyzed her for life. I was 16, just started driving, and had no idea I had a seizure disorder. I had my first seizure behind the wheel, ran through an intersection, and T-boned a van with a nanny and 4 small children. Thankfully, all the kids ended up fine, and were actually running around after the accident saying that was fun. Let's do it again. But the nanny did not end up okay. I talked to her only once after, and she said she wasn't angry at all. It made me feel like shit though, and I think about it a lot. I don't know if it counts as an accident, but someone mugged me, gave him everything, and he still tried to stab me. Just by default, after a decade of martial arts training, I redirected the knife into his chest. It messed me up for a while, but it was him or me, I guess. I've always had a pretty low empathy quotient, so it's probably easier for me than most people, but I just try not to think about it. My brother-in-law died a few years ago. He was a young adult, crossing the street on his skateboard against the light, and was hit by a driver who was already in motion, and had the right of way. From the driver's perspective, he just popped out from behind an immobile truck in the left lane, directly into his path. In the months after the funeral, my wife found the driver's contact info from the police report, and wrote him a letter, telling him about her brother's life, and letting him know that they don't blame him, and that he shouldn't blame himself. She got a letter back a few weeks later from this young man, who had obviously been really struggling with it, and he was extremely grateful for my wife's letter, that it helped lift some of the guilt he'd been feeling. He said the accident had made him really rethink his life, how fragile it is, and he was changing careers into something he could use to make a difference for people. I think my brother-in-law, who was simultaneously the biggest hearted and most cynical person I've ever known, would have scoffed at that, but eventually respected it. My 16-year-old brother and 3 of his friends went out drinking one night. On their way back home, my brother swerved to miss a Volkswagen and hit a utility pole. The pole fell, crushing his 2 friends in the back of the truck to death. The third boy was sitting shotgun in the cab, and it damaged his right arm, which had to be amputated. My brother had grown up with these boys, and he felt awful about what happened. The parents of the dead boys told my brother they didn't blame him, but he blamed himself, and started drinking heavily. He died of liver disease when he was 31. Back in the 80s, my brother killed his best friend when a gun they were playing with accidentally went off. Yes, very stupid. Guns are not toys, always loaded, etc etc. My mom had to clean the blood off the kitchen floor and never allowed guns in the house again. I couldn't even have water guns when I was little, and she was visibly freaked out by the prop gun I had to use for a school play once. This all happened before I was born, so I only understood weird unspoken tension around guns in our house when I was older, and it was explained to me. Edit. Actually it was after The Sixth Sense came out. Remember that scene with the teenage boy saying he wanted to show you his dad's gun, and then he turns around, and the back of his head's blown off. He was the right age, in the right clothes, and my mom went ghost white when she saw that scene. I think she called my brother and warned him not to go see it. As for my brother, he spent I think 2 years of his high school career at the boys' ranch instead of in school. That simultaneously helped him and gave him a bunch of not so awesome friends. He spent about a decade on drugs, being kicked out of university for drugs, making highly questionable life decisions, working as a short order cook at a tiny slimy restaurant, overall not liking himself very much. Then back in the 90s he had a baby with his girlfriend at the time. Caring for his daughter gave him the impetus to clean up and start living with himself instead of zoning out through chemical means, although it took almost another decade to really get better, including a few years where he somehow managed to substitute zoning out with video games for drugs, and lost a couple jobs and relationships that way, and during that time his girlfriend understandably left him. He is doing wonderfully today, in his late 40s. He has a fulfilling career, a house, a wife, 3 kids, and most of the time just talks about how lucky he is. I think he feels like he got a second chance at life. His oldest daughter spends summers with him and is starting college next year. His family is fantastic. He is fantastic. I think he still thinks about his friend from time to time, but he has lived with it for decades, and it is now part of his life story instead of the entirety of his life story. Guilt isn't his primary emotion in life anymore. He's got a lot of love around him. I used to work at a very large hospital in Utah on a floor where the docs like to send patients that were near death. One of the patients I was taking care of that day was a middle-aged lady who was going home that day on hospice, end-of-life care. She was unconscious for a few days and had just recently woken up. Since she was unable to eat or drink anything while unconscious, she almost immediately asked for some water. We were reluctant, but gave in eventually, figuring she's going go home soon and drink there anyway. I did my best to reduce the risk of aspiration, but due to severe pain I couldn't sit her up as far as I would like. She took a drink and aspirated on it, basically drowned in front of her daughter. I'll never forget the sheer panic on those faces. I was 10 years old and I was playing in the woods by a lake with my best friend. We were playing with BB guns and were throwing lawn darts around like idiots. I was shooting my BB gun when he was crouching to pick one of the darts up. I was shooting above him, and right at that moment he got up, and the 1 in a million chance occurred that I hit him right in the eye. He stumbled back and plummeted right into the lake. I didn't notice I shot him in the eye and called out for him. Then I noticed blood in the water. He hit his head on the stone ground. I ran towards him as fast as I could. I dragged him out of there. Now, this was in 1984, so we didn't have any cell phones. Thus I strapped my shirt around his entire head and carried him back to my house, which luckily wasn't too far away. He now has a glass eye and suffers from serious memory loss, long term. 30 years later, and I'm still friends with him. He doesn't remember what happened that day, but I feel so much guilt for it. I can never forgive myself. I have killed someone. It wasn't accidental, but it wasn't intentional either. I was in the Navy and was involved with border patrols for illegal fishermen, boat people, smugglers, etc. off the north of Australia. We are to board a boat of illegal fishermen who had been dynamite netting, and they made a dash for international waters. I was part of the boarding party and we all jumped into the rib and intercepted. The fishing crew, to stop us from boarding, had sharpened bamboo poles they had dipped into the bilge to jab at us to stop us from boarding before they got to international. We had orders not to shoot, but to defend ourselves if attacked. We got in close, and one of the fishermen went to jab the guy next to me, and I swung and hit him with a butt of my shotgun. I intended to knock him down or out but not to kill him, but due to adrenaline, put a lot more force into it than I intended, crushing his skull. We were able to board, and the guy was medevaced, but he died on the flight to Darwin. Emotionally I was fucked up for a long time. They don't tell you this, but killing is so easy that it's scary, and it was the ease of which I did it that bothered me, more easier than any guilt I had for taking a life. At the time I didn't feel anything like guilt or pleasure, just shock at how easy it was. Then I felt guilty for not feeling anything. For a long time I thought I was a monster and stayed away. I eventually got help and was diagnosed with PTSD, but even so I don't feel the same and don't like to get too close to people. It definitely had a very negative effect on my life. Almost sort of. When I was younger my best friend had been struggling with depression for a few years. She called me late one night as I was getting ready for bed and said she needed to talk. I was just getting into the shower and promised to call her back when I was clean. I got into that warm fuzzy post shower oh my god my bed is so comfortable bedtime state and neglected to call. The next day I couldn't get a hold of her and figured she was angry. The day after that I found out she had taken a few bottles of pills that night and they weren't sure if she was going to wake up. I spent the next 2 days in hell. I was in class when I got the call that she woke up and the first thing she asked for was Emmy. Only time I have ever sobbed out of happiness. I have made a point to make my shoulders as available as possible ever since. She passed away 2 years later. I miss her terribly. My babysitter, around 16, was at his house with his sister and a mutual friend. They got drunk and were playing with a shotgun. My babysitter told his sister to shoot him in the face, but don't worry because it wasn't loaded and the safety was on. Neither of those facts were true. His sister shot him in the face and instantly killed him. After that, his sister went hard drug addict, kicked out of school, homeless for a while, major problems. The family, unwarranted, was shunned by a lot of people for having a gun laying around like that. The family was, and still is, a complete mess, roughly 20 years later. In 2012, I hit and killed a woman while driving drunk. I was 19 at the time. I was not even remotely aware of the extent of the damage until the next day, when my father informed me. So much has happened between then and now it's hardly believable. I spent 13 months in jail on for negligent manslaughter. Truth be told, it sucked. Everything about the situation sucks. Not a day goes by that I don't think about her. I tell her I'm sorry daily and talk to her a bit when I can bring myself to do it. I didn't know her before death, but I now know her spirit every day. I have a job and family and do what I have to do to keep the dark from eclipsing my mind. But I'm working through it every day. Please don't drink and drive. This can happen to you. P.S. Thank you, Op, for asking a sincere question like this. There's not nearly enough knowledge of these things in most people's lives unless they've been directly affected. I was with my parents when we accidentally killed a woman who walked across the highway. They found she had drugs in her system from the autopsy, but not necessarily from that day, but she was on a downward spiral and her mother knew it too. She was in her 20s. Overall it just seemed we were the ones she chose to walk in front of to end her life. It was quite a sad story for her, and we were sad for her, and tried to talk to her mother. It's been a year now, but we are fine. I mean we never knew her after all. Before someone asks, yes our van was totaled. RIP. I was working in a bar a few summers ago. It was coming close to closing time and everyone was drunk but no one was belligerent or in need of being cut off. A man came to the bar. I served him his last drink. He left the bar and called his girlfriend. She heard him being hit by the taxi over the phone. He died instantly. I didn't kill him, neither did the taxi driver, but it's hard not to think about things like, would I think about this less if I hadn't been the last one to serve him? Death is strange. Did you think this was a funny video? Please like and subscribe. Any questions? Leave a comment.